We will now be exhorted by our brother David Beale on the theme of enduring under the trials of life to prepare our thoughts to take the emblems. Thanks, Brother David.
Thank you, Brother Chairman. And you'll all be pleased to know I've got my notes. The Psalms of David contain many wonderful and helpful exhortations for us today. It's where a saint could go to find the psalm which helps them with perhaps a situation that they're faced with, as much as they were recorded for in times past. So, if there was a problem in the life and circumstances of King David, in his meditations, he thought about them and he wrote them down, those helpful spiritual thoughts that came out of his mind. And every one of us are beneficiaries of that. Looking at the Psalms, brothers and sisters, I think I can only point at one psalm which predates the Psalms of David. That is Psalm 90, and is called in the book of Psalms a Psalm of Moses. The rest belong to the time of David and those who succeeded him in the same manner of exhortation for the saints of their days. Other psalms have been written during the times of David or later, even up to the time of the return from the exile. I'd like you to turn to Psalm 89 just by way of a little exercise. You notice at the very beginning of Psalm 89, the heading on the top there is a mashgil of Ethan the Ezrahite. A mashgil simply means a psalm of instruction. But who is this Ethan the Ezrahite? Well, it's not so mysterious when we have a look at this psalm. Ethan was a wise person in the times of David and Solomon. In fact, he was compared with Solomon as far as his wisdom was concerned. So we find that if we have a look at this psalm, towards the latter part of it, you'll notice there the references to David. So you must therefore say that this psalm comes after David is on the scene, or after his death. But be that as it may, brothers and sisters, it helps date this as his reflection upon the important subject of the promises that were made to David. So Ethan actually comments on the promises made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. Hence the psalm was written after 2 Samuel 7 occurred. So we can pick that up in some of the words. Verse 34, "My covenant will I not break, nor alter the thing that is gone out of my lips. Once have I sworn by my holiness that I will not lie unto David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me," God. So you can see by this there are, as it were, partial paraphrases from 2 Samuel 7. And that is really, really helpful to understand the spirit of that psalm. I'll take verse 20. "I found David, my servant, with my holy oil have I anointed him, with whom my hand shall be established. My arm also shall strengthen him. So this is dealing with the issues that David was dealing with in his own lifetime. They're very important issues which affect us all here today. But there's a problem which every person had up to then and up to our own age. That is the problem of mortality. The problem of mortality is one which none of us can escape prior to the coming of Christ. When you look at some of the more latter verses of this psalm, you can pick up some of these thoughts. The days of his youth, in verse 45, hast thou shortened, thou hast covered him with shame, Selah. How long, Yahweh, wilt thou hide thyself forever? Shall thy wrath burn like fire? Remember how short my time is. Wherefore hast thou made all men in vain? So there the psalmist reflects upon the fact that he can live, but he will eventually die and pass away. And so that is a sad thought for those who look for righteousness in God. That is, made all men in vain. Verse 48, what man is he that lives and shall not see death? Shall he deliver his soul from the hand of the grave? Lord, where are thy former loving kindnesses, which thou swearest unto David in thy truth? So that takes us back again, does it not, to the promises made to King David, the promise of an everlasting kingdom, which necessitates that there be immortality. So there is the problem about life. And you don't think about that much when you're young, you do when you're older. So there it is. Mortality is a problem to the psalmist as well as to all of us. But then we have this mysterious psalm in Psalm 90, which is, as the heading says, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. So this predates all the other psalms. But there's some interesting words in it. Let's have a look in verse 3. Thou turnest man to destruction and sayest, return, ye children of men. That is contrasted there with the enduring qualities of God. 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday, when it is past, and as a watch in the night. Verse 13, pick up the same word. Return, O Lord. Question mark, how long? Let it repent thee concerning thy servants. O satisfy us early with thy mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad in all our days. So you can see, brothers and sisters, it's the same problem that Moses saw right throughout his life, and especially the wilderness wanderings with the children of Israel. It's the problem of mortality. And he is reflecting upon the words which are written in Genesis chapter 3, which is a sentence passed upon Adam. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. And the psalmist, being Moses, who also wrote Genesis 3, comments upon that, and he says, return, ye children of men, or Adam. Return. It's the commandment of God. Unto dust shalt thou return. But the question is in verse 13, for how long? This was what was bothering Moses because of what he had written beforehand and what he was faced with, seeing mortality enhanced during the wilderness wanderings. So you can see, brothers and sisters, Psalm 89 is placed right next to Psalm 90. One is the sentence of death being commented upon, whereas that brings you straight to Genesis 3 and that sentence. Hence, I believe they like that in the book of Psalms. It was earlier in the month that I came across Psalm 17 while we're doing our readings, and I thought that's a terrific psalm for an exhortation. It's not too difficult. That is a thought which we need to consider. It was very exhortational to myself, especially with what was happening around the world with its political turmoil and the COVID crisis. That virus is raging in many countries of the world, and the numbers are being upped as time goes on, and the estimation of the danger of that virus is being accelerated as more and more different strains come out. I'd like to share a few thoughts with you on this psalm. Psalm 17 is a psalm of David. There are a number of books, expositions in the Brotherhood, and on the Psalms, and some of them are a bit skimpy, but the best one is this one here, which is a book of on studies on Psalms put out by the Study Service, and they're written by different writers, each individual psalm, and that's the best one of the lot. It goes into matters with much more detail. It's been subjected, of course, prior to publication with some very careful work of editing. In that book, and the four of them, what you'll find is towards the front part, on the contents page, is a list of who wrote the commentary upon those psalms. And I'd just like to point out that this Psalm 17 was written by a beloved brother, John King, who was a member of this ecclesia for many, many years, and his expositions were always greatly valued. And the subject, of course, is a plea for divine justice. That is the sort of book you really need when you're doing your readings. So when you're doing your readings, have it there and flip open the pages and look at the introductory pages in there. So I just thought I'd put that in because it makes the readings much more valuable. So Psalm 17 is a prayer of David. A prayer of David. That's an important thing because it indicates to us the great deal of spiritual thought that David put into it, so that we might have a record of that at some later stage. A prayer of David. That means there were things troubling David, and he took it to God in prayer. He took it to God in prayer, and I'm mentioning that twice simply for the reason that that was David's answer. It was his way out of that problem which was encircling him in the form of Saul and his thousands of warriors. Prayer is very, very important. The writer of these books has carefully deduced in the psalm that it was written on the occasion of David hiding from Saul in the southern regions of Judah. He was hiding from Saul. Saul was pursuing him from place to place. And this is helpful to note down that at the top of this psalm it doesn't actually say the exact circumstances, but if you look at the evidence of it, it looks like it's very much this one. And you can pick that up in that book. So David was not wanting to have any confrontation with Saul. He was outnumbered, but he knew how madly driven Saul was. He was just driven by hatred. So he's pursuing him from place to place, and David was trying to make certain that he never caught up with him. And so David is really perplexed. Saul has enough men to, as it were, if David's on this side of the mountain, Saul's on that side of the mountain, Saul has enough to encircle him that way. So that would have meant a dreadful skirmish and bloodbath. The solution was this. David prays about it, and Saul suddenly gets a tap on his shoulder and says to him, "Ave, Saul, you better drop what you're doing and come north because the Philistines are after us up there. We need your army." And you can imagine the exasperation on Saul's face. Just when we thought we had him. So David didn't even have to lift a finger. He just prayed to God. And that is the intent of the psalm, brothers and sisters. The value of this psalm is to read of David's prayer and how he besought God to see him through his difficulty. In verses 1 to 6, we have the verses where David was seeking God's help in his trials. So that was step one. It was David in this prayer who reminded God of his innocence, as well as the fact God had proved his heart in other circumstances before that time. So David saw that as another trial, and David was greatly concerned with it. And he had to think to himself in his prayer to God how to rightly frame that. Let's have a look in verse 3. He says, "Thou hast proved," past tense, "my heart. Thou hast visited," past tense, "me in the night. Thou hast," past tense, "tried me, and shall find nothing. I am purposed that my mouth shall not transgress." You imagine that's the first place that a person under this great duress, it's the first thing that they would start to feel the pressure. Next, David had known that he was chosen by God as the replacement for Saul. But David knew this, that morally speaking, he could not lift up his hand against Yahweh's anointed. That would be for God to do that, as much as God had anointed David. What therefore goes is the question. What therefore goes? So in verses 3 to 5, we have the bold language of a good conscience. David was pleading to God upon the basis of his personal integrity and sincerity. This is something for us to keep in mind in our walk before our God. The basis of personal integrity and sincerity. Yet David was the one who would compose Psalm 34 prior to this, where he says that the angel of God encamps around those that love and fear him and delivers them. Psalm 34 is written with the assistant instances of divine help in David's mind, already given and experienced. Might I say, brothers and sisters, that at this time, these qualities of sincerity and integrity, as found in Psalm 17, are ones that our world, our present world, cares less for than it did years ago. Sincerity and integrity, though, are the keys to our eternal future. You may have heard of or seen the lead up to the inauguration of President Biden and all the turmoil that preceded that. And one of the pieces that came up against the integrity and sincerity of Trump was all the lies that he had told. So this person at that time had published a book which says, here's a list of the 215,000 lies that Trump has said in the time of his presidency. That, of course, wouldn't go down with most people as far as the number of his lies were concerned. Yet Trump seemed to ignore it. He saw no problem in it at all. These are values of wickedness that our present world sees no problem with. And in our daily lives, brothers and sisters, we need to make sure that our present commercial world does not harm the scriptural values that we've learnt from the Bible. We need to make certain that our yea is yea and our nay is nay. In verse 3 of Psalm 17, he says, I am purposed that my mouth shall not transgress. He then says, I have called upon thee, and here he was, seeking at the gateway of prayer that God would bless him because of his attitude to the principles which God would have him to show in his life. For thou wilt fear me, will hear me. Prayer is a very important thing. And that's why David truly knew the value of prayer, and that God, brothers and sisters, is waiting for us to submit our prayers to him. So he may bring trials upon us. He's just waiting for us to knock on his door with our prayer, to seek his help. God's already got the answers worked out for you. But that's what he's doing. It was under the great duress of Saul chasing him after him with thousands of men that David knew the lesson that if God is for us, who can be against us? But our relationship, brothers and sisters, with God is really not a set and forget one at all. God wants to hear our pleas to his throne. Many more lessons, brothers and sisters, in this section. We don't have the time for it, so let's move on. The next section in the psalm is verses 6 to 12, in which is a prayer for help against his deadly enemy. So nowhere in the psalm do you hear the name Saul. But David lays his petition and his complaint before God against people who are really undesirable. Undesirable. You know, they were stacked against David. Terrible odds. There was Saul, who was driven by a very mad hate, a deadly hate, as David very well knew with the dodging of javelins. Then there were several thousand soldiers under arms who were there to do his bidding. Fancy having a division of Doegs on your side. Cutthroats. Doeg the Edomite, deadly and determined. He had no conscience at all. Men like Doeg never went to Sunday school. Then there were the scared folk who saw what bloodshed Saul caused through men like Doeg. These people who were in these towns in the southern part of Judah, who wondered what would happen if they really gave a little bit of support to David. What would happen? We're sure to find out. Just keep out of it, you know. And there was this scare which had come across all these people. These people were afraid of looking like, or actually crossing, Saul. Remember the pleas to God David made as to whether the men of Keilah would betray him? Even though David saved them from other enemies prior to this, yes, they will betray him. In his prayer to God, David was confident that Yahweh would answer him because of the integrity of his heart and because also of the faithfulness of God himself. In verse 6 we read there, I have called upon thee, for thou wilt hear me, O God. Incline thine ear unto me, and hear my speech. So here was the plea made to our God in heaven. There's a little point that Brother John makes in these notes on Psalms, and he says there, well, actually the word there for hear, for thou wilt hear me, the word here has been translated elsewhere as answer. He knew that God would answer him. And this implies more than just hearing. And David had many experiences of the help of Yahweh being with him in times past. Yet he didn't presume upon that. Like I said before, he had to make his prayer to God. Hence he said, "Incline thine ear unto me, and hear my speech." In verse 7, David uses the term for God in a most unique way. You sometimes hear it in prayers, the wonderful character of God. You know, it's just simply the term, "O thou, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob." These types of terms tend to show the outworking of God in others' lives. So here, God is addressed by his works, in contrast to using the name of God. The right hand is the place of God's strength in verse 7. "Thou that savest with thy right hand," that's the place of God's strength. Then in verse 8 is another descriptive phrase to denote the very sensitive part of the body, called the apple of the eye or the pupil. There, the tenderness of that part is compared with the soft part of the eagle under the shadow of its wings. In other words, the fluffy feathers underneath the wings of the eagle. Very sensitive. David desperately wanted God's protection from evil, and he calls for that. But you know what? He never names Saul as such, because by David invoking divine protection, he also knew how powerful Yahweh was. David was backing off from the definitive naming of God, as much as he wouldn't be mentioning Saul's name. David did not want to describe his enemy in clear, unequivocal words. He would leave that to God. As he says there in those verses there, "From the wicked that oppress me, from my deadly enemies that compass me about. They are enclosed in their own fat. With their mouth they speak proudly. They have compassed us in our steps. They have set their eyes, bowing down to the earth like as a lion that is greedy of his prey. As it were a young lion lurking in secret places." Do you know who I'm speaking about, God? Yes, it's him. Verses 13 to 15 are the finale. They are the finale, and it comprises David's desire by God upon his enemy. Most interesting little comment there. He says there in 13, "Arise, O Yahweh. Disappoint him, cast him down." And that, I believe, is also referred to in Psalm 68, verse 1, and it relates back to Numbers 10, verse 35. It was the invocation made when the ark of God was lifted up in the wilderness to begin a journey. "Arise, O Lord," and I've lost the place. Numbers 10, "when all else fails." Numbers 10, verse 35. "And it came to pass when the ark set forward, Moses said, Rise up, Lord, let thine enemies be scattered. Let them that hate thee flee before thee." And so that was David invoking, I believe, the very sentiments of that passage there at that time. Here, brothers and sisters, are two classes of people being contrasted in verse 14 and 15. From men, in verse 14, which are thine hand, yes, you've made them, O Yahweh, from the men of the world, yes, they're very worldly, which have their portion in this life. Yes, they've got their farms and they've got their homes. They've got all those things. Whose belly thou fillest with thy hid treasure. You send the rain on the just and on the unjust. Yes, they have productive families. They leave the rest of their substance to their babes. They're not destitute. There's that lot. But as for me, he says, I will behold thy face in righteousness. I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness. That was the class he wanted to be in the kingdom of God. So David therefore lays his petition before God and requests divine help, when in effect without God's blessing at that time he will be truly caught by Saul. There was literally no hope at that time, humanly speaking. There comes times in our lives, brothers and sisters, when we may be faced with difficulties which also may appear insurmountable. David's answer: lay that petition before God, who has all the answers. Lay that petition before God. And that is going to be the answer for us to see our way through the difficulties of these last days. Every one of us have been faced with problems. The time of this epidemic that the world's gone through and has been over here in a form which has been minuscule compared to the disaster overseas. Remember the words of the Psalm, 4 verse 8, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep, for thou, Yahweh, only makest me to dwell in safety. And that is a real test for all of us. I'd just like to read these thoughts from a lampstand last year. The pain and possible tragedies of COVID-19 can strengthen us to be a people more focused on pleasing our God. So that's interesting, isn't it? Perhaps this is the angels as ministering spirits giving the heirs of salvation just one last warning before the Lord is at hand, as written by Brother Bruce Gerd. In conclusion, I'd like to say, for you all, may the merciful hand of God keep you at all times in his love and in his care. And may we therefore take the memorials of Christ's suffering and rejoice in that he has overcome. He was the one, brothers and sisters, who prayed to God, and his sweat was, as it were, great drops of blood prior to his greatest trial. We need to be able to look beyond our troubles to the time of the advent of the kingdom, as Christ bids us to his kingdom. He bids us to his kingdom. We've got to submit to God our concerns through prayer and also seek for him answers to those concerns. Thank you.